The room was already filled with the low murmur of grief when the coffin was closed. Flowers lined the walls, their sweet scent clashing with the heavy silence of loss. Family members stood shoulder to shoulder, some staring at the floor, others at the polished wood that now separated them from someone they believed they would never see again. It was supposed to be the final moment, the end of a life. But what if death had made a mistake? What if, in that room, surrounded by prayers and tears, the person inside the coffin was not dead at all? What if she was about to wake up? This is not a legend. This is not a horror story written to scare. This is a real case, one that exposed the terrifying thin line between life and death and forced doctors, families, and entire communities to confront a question no one wants to ask. How certain are we, really, when we declare someone dead? To understand how something like this could happen, we need to go back to the beginning, to the life of the woman at the center of this story. Her name was often described as ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of name that blends into a crowd, which is perhaps why her story shocked so many people. She lived a quiet life, known by neighbors as reserved, polite, someone who kept routines and rarely caused concern. In the weeks leading up to her supposed death, however, those close to her noticed subtle changes. She complained of fatigue, deep exhaustion that sleep did not seem to fix. There were moments of dizziness, shortness of breath, and a strange coldness in her hands that lingered even in warm rooms. She brushed it off, like so many people do, assuming stress, age, or a temporary illness. The day everything changed began without drama. She collapsed at home, alone, and was later found unresponsive. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived to a scene that felt already finished. Her body was cold to the touch. Her pulse was faint, almost impossible to detect. Her breathing, if present at all, was shallow and irregular. Time was moving against her. After attempts to resuscitate her failed, she was pronounced dead. The official declaration came quickly, clinically, a few words that carried irreversible weight. Time of death was recorded. Paperwork was completed. Her body was transferred. What no one realized in that moment was that her condition was not death, but something far more deceptive, a rare medical state, one capable of mimicking death so convincingly that even trained professionals can be misled. Catalepsy, a condition in which the body becomes rigid, breathing slows to nearly nothing, and vital signs drop so low they are almost undetectable. To an untrained eye, and sometimes even to a trained one, it looks like the end. Her family was notified. Shock turned into grief with brutal speed. Arrangements were made. The funeral home prepared her body, following procedures that had been repeated thousands of times before. She was dressed, placed in the coffin, her face carefully arranged into an expression of peace that she was not actually experiencing. The lid was closed. For everyone present, the story was over. The wake was held the following day. Friends and relatives came to pay their respects. People whispered memories, cried softly, clutched tissues, and tried to process the suddenness of it all. And inside the coffin, something extraordinary was happening. Her brain, starved of stimulation but still alive, was slowly pulling her back. Consciousness returned not with clarity, but with confusion and terror. Darkness, pressure, no air. The realization came in fragments. She tried to move. Her arms would not respond. Her legs felt like stone. Panic surged, but her body betrayed her again, refusing to obey. Then a sound. At first, it was so faint that those nearby thought it was imagination. A soft tapping, irregular, almost rhythmic. Someone paused mid-conversation. Another sound followed, a dull thud coming from inside the coffin. Silence fell over the room. People looked at one another, searching for reassurance, for a rational explanation that would make this moment go away. The sound came again, louder this time. There was no denying it. The coffin was moving. Chaos erupted. Screams broke the stillness. Someone shouted to open it. Hands trembled as they fumbled with the latches. When the lid was finally lifted, What they saw would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Her eyes were open, wide, panicked. She was alive. The shock was so intense that for a few seconds, no one moved. Time seemed to freeze. Then reality crashed back in. She was rushed to the hospital, gasping, disoriented, her body still struggling to function normally. Doctors fought to stabilize her, trying to understand how she could have been declared dead. Tests confirmed it. She had never died. The aftermath of her awakening was not a miracle movie ending. It was a psychological battlefield. Imagine waking up inside your own funeral. Imagine hearing people mourn you while you are trapped, unable to scream. The trauma carved itself deep into her mind. She suffered from nightmares, panic attacks, and an overwhelming fear of being alone. Sleep became her enemy. Coffins, dark rooms, silence, all became triggers. Medical professionals launched investigations. The declaration of death was reviewed. Protocols were examined. The conclusion was unsettling but clear. Human error combined with a rare medical condition. No malice, no conspiracy, just a system that failed at the worst possible moment. Historically, cases like this are not as rare as we would like to believe. Before modern medicine, the fear of premature burial was so widespread that safety coffins were invented, complete with bells and air tubes, designed to give the buried a last chance to signal they were still alive. Entire societies lived with the terror of being declared dead too soon. And even today, with advanced technology, mistakes still happen. Her case reignited public debate. How do we define death? How much certainty is enough? Should protocols be stricter? Should waiting periods be mandatory? Her story appeared in news reports, medical journals, whispered conversations. Some called it a miracle. Others called it negligence. For her, it was simply survival at an unimaginable cost. She lived on, but she was never the same. The woman who once enjoyed quiet routines now avoided silence. The idea of funerals terrified her. She spoke publicly only once, her voice shaking as she described the darkness, the panic, the moment she realized she was trapped inside what everyone else believed was her final resting place. She said the most terrifying part was not the fear of dying, but the certainty that no one could hear her. In the end, her story leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. Death is not always a clear line. It is sometimes a shadow, a pause, a space where life lingers quietly, waiting to be noticed. And it forces us to ask a question that lingers long after the screen goes dark. How many times have we been wrong without ever knowing it? And if you were lying there, silent, aware, waiting for someone to notice, would anyone hear you before it was too late?